I mean, I think the vision for the work in South Africa was similar in many respects to the vision for the whole foundation. So the mission of the foundation is to make a lasting difference in the lives of disadvantaged and vulnerable communities. There are sort of, I think, two main elements to that. One is who are the disadvantaged and vulnerable, and the second is how can you make lasting change. So that tells you who you might work with, and it tells you something about the character of work that you might have to do. So it tells you, for example, that providing services to people isn't probably going to make the lasting change. It's going to ameliorate the conditions. So, that kind of mission leads you to things about, what are the root causes of some of these problems, and what kind of systemic things can you do that would actually make a lasting difference.
In 2002, a new CEO took over at Atlantic, John Healy, and new CEOs tend to change institutions. And at the same time, the board decided that Atlantic would be a limited life foundation, and it would spend down its endowment over a period of time. And out of that came a philosophy of looking at areas where, over a relatively short period of time, as opposed to a perpetual foundation, over a relatively short period of time, you could focus and have real impact. And Atlantic had, up to that point, invested a huge amount in higher education, in building civil society, and some other program areas. And so there was a very thoroughgoing review of the areas in which we had worked, and an exploration of where we might have more impact. And the four areas that emerged out of that were human rights, health of populations, aging, and children and disadvantaged youth. And not all of those programs applied in all of the jurisdictions in which Atlantic worked. But in South Africa, we concentrated on health of populations and on human rights as new program areas, and we exited from the old program areas. And I think that our starting point was the very progressive constitution that emerged as part of the democratization of South Africa. And our feeling was the constitution gave us a powerful platform to have an impact on the human rights of disadvantaged groups. So we carried out, again, as part of this review of Atlantic strategies, we carried out a very extensive audit of groups that were vulnerable in terms of access to human and socioeconomic rights. And we came up with a list of about 10 groups that included people with HIV and AIDS, women affected by gender-related violence, and so on. And we then had to narrow that down to 3 groups where we thought we could have a particular impact. And those groups were the gay and lesbian community, farm workers and the rural poor, and migrants and refugees. And what we set out to do there was to build an infrastructure to protect the human rights of those groups, because an infrastructure did not exist. So that was the main objective of investing in those 3 areas. The case that the Treatment Action Campaign and the Legal Resources Centre brought against the government in relation to access to drugs to counter HIV and AIDS through the public health system, that was a dramatic achievement. In effect, it has saved the lives of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. But other litigation has had very important impact. So, for example, the Legal Resources Centre's case to have the Communal Land Rights Act struck down, which affects something like 16 million women in rural areas who are subject to the rule of traditional leaders, and who in terms of customary law cannot inherit land, cannot own land. That law was struck down by the Constitutional Court, and the transformative effects of that we have yet to see, but it will change the lives of women in rural areas who will now be able to own land, inherit land, and enhance their livelihoods.
So I think that what Atlantic did in particular, I think more than Open Society and Ford, and I hope that one day we can emulate what Atlantic did, was to set the bar quite high for giving in relation to issues that are quite neglected or politically neglected. And if it wasn't for Atlantic's funding, I mean, all of our work around sexual orientation, protection and equality of rights, from civil union marriages to challenging unfair discriminatory policies, to issues around HIV/AIDS, to issues around being queer, in South Africa, to issues around being a sex worker, that was all of the work that Atlantic led.
I think what we have done through Atlantic is we have concentrated on trying to build a record of the anti-apartheid period in terms of the human rights abuses that occurred, but also in terms of the struggle. And our emphasis has been on surfacing records that are not yet in the public realm, and also what we call surfacing hidden histories and silenced voices. So in a sense, trying to build a more complex archival account of what happened in that period. But I think what we've also done is we've supported what we call archival activism. The traditional archive collects documents and records and makes them available to researchers and scholars. Archival activists take that material and put it out into the public realm in interesting and innovative ways that excite debate, that get people talking about what happened in the past, get people talking about what reconciliation means, what citizenship is, what nationhood is. And I think that some of that material has had an impact on the kind of debate that we have about our past and what we need to do to overcome the divisions and the traumas that have been inherited from the past.
And I mean, right now, there's very few donors, local and internationally, that will actually give towards decriminalizing sex work, towards equal protection of people who are gay, lesbian, transgender, or intersex. And some of the organizations that Atlantic started funding or seeded, who are based in sort of community settings ranging from Khayelitsha to the Eastern Cape is I think quite remarkable. The work that is done on ECD, the work that is done on a number of issues is just, I'm not sure how you're ever going to be able to unearth the impact that it has had. One, on the way in which government responded to several challenges and issues, and on the other hand, also the way in which civil society was able to build itself and grow. And it was because Atlantic was willing to take the risk, and Atlantic was willing to do that risque funding, that other donors were able to actually come into that space.
So we began very early on to start collaborating with them and talking about what they were doing and how we can work together. And I think we had a very fruitful relationship with Atlantic, as did many people. Gerald was very visionary and really set the tone and set the kind of environment for other funders to come in and work on things. It made things a lot easier for us. There was pretty much an established social justice field as a result of Atlantic's funding.
I think the way Atlantic gave was a wonderful, wonderful creative understanding of the role of civil society and the fact that we are working in a very fast changing society, and so that all the well-meant plans in the world often have to change, and it really depends on organizations and their leadership to change as required.
And so what Atlantic did was it allowed us as a new generation of activists and social justice activists and community organizers and public interest lawyers and researchers to actually build a new jurisprudence, which I think now when you look back is something that at that time we took for granted. I mean, we were blessed with a new constitution. We immediately took that and started shaping a whole new socioeconomic and civil political jurisprudence. And I think if it wasn't for Atlantic and Gerald in particular, the entire manner in which donors would engage with grantees would, I think, have been very different. The agenda would then have been set by the donor as opposed to the agenda being set by the grantee.
Atlantic was always a very activist funder, so beyond simply giving the money, there was a sense of wanting to build a movement, an LGBTI movement across South Africa and Southern Africa. And so there was a very engaged approach. On the one hand, Gerald personally was involved in the movement himself, but was willing to take risks, was willing to invest in initiatives that others may have felt could not be easily managed, probably was not easy to account for in terms of the activities and financial management. But he took the risk, and in fact the LGBTI movement in South Africa owes a great deal to that risk-taking.
There was a clear mission of field building. So you had, for example, a whole range of grantees that were involved with community advice officers, and the field was built. You had a whole range who were dealing with the rural poor or who were involved in human rights, and the field was built. So although individual organizations had a huge flexibility in terms of what they wanted to do and a lot of independence, the crafting of Atlantic programs was something spectacular, actually. And that is why it's left such a gap, because they built whole fields of endeavor in the human rights space in South Africa, and I've not seen that done by anyone else.